What happens when a woman thinks she can take over everything, including the family home, after her husband's death? Sarah's father is in hospice, and the tension is thick in the air. His wife, Karen, and her kids have been living in what Sarah knows is her house, and now they think they're entitled to it. But Karen doesn't know the truth. This house isn't hers. It was Sarah who bought it for her dad years ago. Now, as the end draws near, everything is about to change. Stay tuned to see how Sarah takes control, and make sure to subscribe for more gripping stories. Gold Digger marries my dad 2 years before his death, and now she expects to take over his estate, but she has no clue who really owns it all. Let me break it down for you. My dad's going into hospice next week, and the situation has been a mess for a while now. We all saw it coming, but that doesn't make it any easier. The house he's living in with his wife Karen and her 2 kids, Brittany and David, isn't even his house. It's mine. I bought it years ago, but you wouldn't know it by the way they've been acting. Let me rewind a little. About 7 years ago, things took a turn for my dad after my mom passed away. They'd been together for over 30 years, and when she died, it completely shattered him. Of course, we all felt the loss, but for my dad, it was like the foundation beneath him just crumbled. A few months later, he lost his job, couldn't keep up with the rent on their apartment, and got evicted. Everything came crashing down at once, and he had no one to turn to. I was all he had left. So, being the only one in a position to help, I bought him a house. Nothing fancy, just a small place in a quiet, older neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, and it gave him a roof over his head when he needed it most. He had his dog Max, too. Honestly, Max was more than just a pet. He was a connection to my mom, a small piece of her that still lingered. That dog became family to us, and it made everything a little easier for him. The first few years, things started to improve. Dad slowly healed, and the house became his sanctuary. He got back on his feet as much as anyone could after losing everything, and Max was always by his side, a constant companion. I'd visit every weekend, and it became our routine. Max would wag his tail like crazy when I showed up, and we'd hang out in the backyard, grilling burgers, catching up, just trying to find some joy again after everything that had happened. Then Karen came into the picture. They met through mutual friends, and before I knew it, they were married. I wasn't against it. I just wanted my dad to be happy. Karen seemed all right at first, polite, always smiling, and she appeared to genuinely care about him. So when he told me she was moving in, I didn't make a big deal out of it. It was his life, after all, even if the house was technically mine. As long as he was happy, that was all that mattered. But that's when things started to get strange. First, it was just Karen moving in, which was fine. Then, out of nowhere, her daughter Brittany showed up with all her things, like she was moving in too. Brittany was in her late 20s, an adult, not someone who needed a place to crash for a weekend. She was there to stay. I didn't say anything. It was my dad's life, and I didn't want to step on his toes, but it felt a little off. A few months went by, and I started noticing more things. Every time I visited, Karen's stuff was everywhere. The house, which once felt like my dad's home, was starting to feel like it was more hers. But I brushed it off. Dad was happy, right? I told myself to just let it be. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get more crowded, David, the younger daughter, moved in. Now it wasn't just Karen. It wasn't just Brittany. It was Karen, Brittany, David, and my dad all under one roof, and you can imagine how that went. At first, I tried to ignore it. Sure, it was strange seeing my dad's home slowly taken over by Karen and her daughters, but what could I do? I wasn't about to tell him how to live his life. But over time, things started to change. The vibe in the house shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't my dad's house anymore. It was Karen's, and her opinion seemed to take precedence. What really started to get to me was how little my dad's voice seemed to matter. The more they settled in, the more everything revolved around what Karen and her daughters wanted. My dad didn't have a say anymore. Things were already going downhill, with Karen and her daughters slowly taking over my dad's house. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get more annoying, we had the whole mess with Max. Let me explain something about Max. This dog wasn't just a pet. Max was family. My mom loved that dog like he was her baby. And after she passed away, Max became my dad's emotional support. It was like Max was the one thing keeping him grounded after everything that happened. I know some people don't get that, but if you've ever had a dog, you know what I mean. So, you can imagine how much it pissed me off when David, Karen's youngest daughter, started complaining about Max, like, really? Max was old, harmless, and spent 90% of his day either sleeping or chasing his own tail when he wasn't too tired. But one day, out of the blue, David comes up with this whole thing about how Max makes her uncomfortable. She said she didn't feel safe with him around. Now, I'm not one to dismiss people's fears, but come on, this was Max, not some rabid wolf. The guy was 12 years old, could barely make it up the stairs without needing a break, and was about as dangerous as a pillow. I didn't take it seriously at first, thought maybe she was just being dramatic, but Karen, of course, jumped in to back her up, making a whole big deal out of it. She started saying that maybe it was time for Max to find a new home, like he was some unwanted furniture that needed to be thrown out. That was my breaking point. I could see the stress it was putting on my dad. He wasn't just being asked to give up a dog, he was being asked to give up the last real connection he had to my mom. It broke my heart to see it, but what could I do? I wasn't living there, and Karen had pretty much taken over the decision-making in the house. I could tell my dad didn't want to get rid of Max, but he was tired. He was dealing with his own health issues, and I guess he didn't have the energy to fight back anymore. So yeah, I stepped in. I told my dad straight up that Max could come live with me. I wasn't going to let Karen or her daughters bully him into giving up that dog. My dad was relieved, but I could tell it still hurt him. I mean, he didn't want to give up Max, but he knew it was the only way to stop the constant arguing in the house. Karen acted like she was doing him some huge favor by letting me take Max in, but I knew better. It wasn't about Max, it was about control. She and her daughters wanted to be the ones calling all the shots, and Max was just another way to push my dad out of the decision-making process in his own home. From that day on, I started bringing Max with me every time I visited, and every single time it was like I was bringing some kind of dangerous animal into the house. Brittany and David would literally act like Max was going to maul them any second. The first time I showed up with him after taking him home, David actually screamed when she saw him, like she hadn't lived with this dog for the past few years. Karen tried to play it off, but you could see her rolling her eyes every time I walked in the door with Max trotting behind me. It was beyond ridiculous. Max would stroll in, tail wagging, completely unbothered, and all they could do was complain about how scary he was. I'd sit with my dad in the backyard, just like we always did, while Max lay quietly in the grass, not bothering anyone. Yet every time David or Brittany peeked out the window, they'd shoot us this disgusted look and scurry away like they were avoiding a vicious attack dog. Honestly, I think they just couldn't stand that Max was still around, because he was a reminder loud and clear that this was my dad's house, not theirs. Max was part of my dad's life, part of my mom's life. No matter how hard they tried to take control, Max was the last link to my dad's old life, and they hated that. Then one day, Karen finally said what I knew was coming. She asked me not to bring Max around anymore. I was livid. Why? I asked, my voice already rising. Max isn't doing anything. He's just lying there. She tried to sugarcoat it, claiming that David still felt uncomfortable, that it would be better if Max didn't come over. But I saw right through it. This wasn't about Max at all. This was about control. She and her daughters had been slowly taking away everything that mattered to my dad, and now they wanted to get rid of the last piece of him that remained. I was seething, but I didn't want to make things harder for my dad. He was already sick, and the last thing I wanted was to stress him out more. So I looked Karen straight in the eye and said, "Max stays. He's not hurting anyone, and if you don't like it, don't come outside when I visit." She didn't like that one bit, but I wasn't backing down. I could tell she was itching to push harder, but I wasn't giving her the chance. From then on, every time I visited, Max came with me, and I didn't care what they thought. My dad deserved at least that much. The tension in the house grew thicker after that. It was as if Karen and her daughters were just waiting for my dad to be gone so they could take full control. I could see it in the way they treated him, like he was just some old man taking up space. But as long as Max and I were around, they couldn't quite push him out completely. Now, with my dad going into hospice, I can already see what's coming. They think they're going to get the house, that everything's going to be theirs once he's gone, but they're in for a rude awakening. This is still my house. And Max? He's going to outlast all of them. With my dad going into hospice soon, I knew my time was running out to say goodbye properly. It was something I dreaded, but I couldn't put it off any longer. He wasn't doing well, and I needed to see him, especially since I'd been the one taking care of Max ever since Karen and her daughters had pushed him aside. I wanted Max to see my dad one last time, to have that moment before everything slipped away. When I showed up at the house, Karen, Brittany, and David were already there. The second I walked in with Max by my side, I could feel the tension in the room. You know when you walk into a place and everything just stops? It was like that. The atmosphere was thick with hostility, but I didn't care. I wasn't there for them. I was there for my dad. Brittany was the first to say something. She looked at Max, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Oh, great, he brought that stupid dog again." She wasn't even trying to hide the attitude. She acted like Max was some kind of wild animal, but the truth is, Max was so old at this point he barely moved unless you coaxed him with a treat or something. But there she was, acting all dramatic like the dog was going to destroy the house. I took a deep breath and ignored her. I wasn't about to start a fight right then, even though I could feel my blood boiling. I just said, "I'm here to see Dad," and headed straight for his room. I could hear Karen say something to David under her breath as I passed, but I didn't catch all of it. Probably some passive-aggressive comment about me or the dog, but whatever. I didn't have the energy to deal with him. When I got to my dad's room, he was lying in bed looking frail, but still awake. His face lit up when he saw me, and when Max trotted in behind me wagging his tail like crazy, my dad smiled for the first time in weeks. It hit me right then how much my dad had missed Max. Max immediately jumped up on the bed, which honestly was a struggle for him with how old he was, but he made it. He curled up next to my dad like they hadn't missed a beat. My dad reached over and scratched behind Max's ears just like he used to. For a few minutes, it was like things were normal again, and I could see how much peace it brought my dad to have Max there. We didn't talk much at first. It was one of those moments where words aren't really needed, you know? I just sat there with him, Max laying between us, and we stayed like that for a bit. I could tell my dad was weaker than the last time I'd seen him, and it hurt to see him like that. But there was also a kind of relief. At least for those few minutes, he looked happy again. After a while, my dad spoke up. "I've missed this old guy," he said, his voice a little shaky, but still carrying that familiar warmth. "It's good to see him again." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without choking up. I didn't want to show how emotional I was getting, so I just reached over and patted Max on the head. We talked for a bit about simple things, memories, stories about Max, old family moments from when Mom was still around. It felt good, but it was also bittersweet. The whole time I kept thinking about how this might be the last time I'd ever see my dad like this, awake and aware. It's a hard thing to wrap your head around even when you know it's coming. And then, of course, Karen had to ruin it. I was getting ready to leave when she walked in, not even bothering to knock. She glanced at Max curled up on the bed next to my dad and immediately looked annoyed. "I thought I asked you not to bring that dog here," she said, crossing her arms and glaring at me like I'd committed some huge crime. I felt the anger bubbling up again, but I stayed calm. "Max isn't hurting anyone," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He's here to say goodbye to Dad. You've got a problem with that?" David, who had followed her mom into the room, piped up from behind her. "Good riddance," she muttered, loud enough for me to hear. "I'm glad we won't have to deal with him after this." That was it. I'd had enough. I stood up, trying to keep my cool, but it wasn't easy. "You know what? I don't care what you think about Max. He's family, and he's staying here as long as I'm here. If you don't like it, tough." Karen looked like she wanted to argue, but my dad cut her off. "It's fine," he said quietly. "Let them be." His voice was soft but firm, and Karen didn't push it any further. I stayed a little while longer after that, mostly to make sure my dad and Max had enough time together, but eventually I had to leave. I knew it was probably the last time I'd bring Max over, and I wanted it to end on a good note. As I was walking out, Brittany was sitting in the living room scrolling through her phone, and she barely looked up when I passed, But just as I was about to reach the door, she said, "I can't wait until we never have to see that dog again." I stopped in my tracks, turned around, and just stared at her for a second, trying to decide if I was really going to engage, but then I just said, "You won't have to," and walked out. I didn't need to give them any more of my time. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how wrong this all felt. It wasn't just about Max, it was about everything. How my dad's house had become something else entirely. How Karen and her daughters had taken over. How they didn't even seem to care about my dad's condition. It was like they were just waiting for him to die so they could get on with their lives. But the joke's on them. This house isn't theirs, and when the time comes, they're going to find that out the hard way. Update 1. After that last visit with my dad, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep tiptoeing around Karen and her daughters, letting them act like they owned the house while I stood by, silent. My dad wasn't getting any better, and it was only a matter of time before he was gone. Once that happened, I knew Karen and her daughters would expect to stay in the house indefinitely. Living there rent-free as they had been for years, I wasn't going to let that happen. Instead of dropping the bomb that the house was mine, I decided to ease into it. I'd start small, testing the waters with something simple rent. Maybe, just maybe, they'd show some responsibility and agree to it, but I wasn't holding my breath. A few days after the emotional visit with my dad, I made my way back to the house. The moment I stepped through the door, the usual scene greeted me. Karen, Brittany, and David lounging in the living room like they didn't have a care in the world. They were laughing at some reality show on TV, acting as if life hadn't just taken a serious turn. My dad was in hospice, and here they were, laughing as though everything was fine. I took a deep breath, my frustration simmering, and walked into the room. Brittany glanced up at me, barely acknowledging my presence, while Karen paused the TV, her face tightening with clear annoyance at the interruption. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want to come off too forceful, but I could feel the frustration bubbling up. Karen raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About what's going to happen after my dad passes," I said. Instantly, the room shifted, the laughter died, and the tension in the air became palpable. All eyes were on me now. Good. They needed to hear this. "I've been thinking about it," I continued, my words deliberate. "And we need to talk about the house." Them. I let the word rent hang in the air, thick and heavy, like a grenade waiting to explode. David let out a mocking laugh. "Rent? What are you talking about?" I didn't flinch. "Once Dad passes, things are going to change. If you want to keep living here, you're going to have to start paying rent. I've already spoken to a lawyer and we figured out a fair amount based on the market value of the house." David's eyes widened and he looked at me like I had just insulted every fiber of his being. Brittany straightened up, her mouth already opening to launch a snarky response, but Karen beat her to it. "Wait a minute," Karen said, narrowing her eyes as if she were trying to figure out if I was serious. "Why would we need to pay rent? James wanted us to stay here." I kept my voice even. "I get that, but I've been covering the costs of this house for years, and I can't do it forever. You've had a good deal here, but it's not going to last. Either you start paying rent or you'll need to find somewhere else to live." The room went deathly quiet. I could almost see the gears turning in Karen's mind as she processed what I'd said. Brittany and David looked like I had just thrown them a curveball they hadn't expected. They were blindsided, stunned that the idea of paying rent had never even crossed their minds. Of course it hadn't. Why would it when they'd been living here for free all this time? Finally, Karen spoke up, her voice sharp. "This is James's house. He wanted us to stay here. You're not going to charge us rent after everything we've done for him." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my cool. "Look, I'm not trying to make this difficult, but the reality is someone has to take care of the expenses, and it's not going to be me anymore. I've already covered everything up until now, but I can't keep doing that after Dad's gone. You either pay rent or you move out. Those are your options." Brittany finally jumped in, her face red with anger. "You're unbelievable. We've been living here for years, and now you're trying to make money off us? What kind of person does that to family?" I sighed, feeling the frustration building. "I'm not trying to make money off anyone. I'm trying to make sure things are handled fairly." I've given you plenty of time, and I'm giving you more time now. 3 months after Dad passes, 3 months to figure out what you're going to do. That's more than fair." David crossed her arms, glaring at me. "So what? You're just going to throw us out if we don't pay?" "I don't want it to come to that," I said, meeting her glare. "But yeah, if you're not willing to pay rent, then you'll have to leave. I can't keep covering the costs for you." Karen stood up then, trying to play the victim card. "I can't believe you'd do this to us after everything we've done for James, everything we've done for this family. You're just going to kick us out like we're nothing." I shook my head. "I'm not kicking you out, I'm giving you options, but like I said, things are going to change, and you need to be ready for that. I'm giving you 3 months to figure it out. That's more than generous." I could see Brittany getting ready to say something else, but I was done with the conversation. I'd said what I needed to say, and I wasn't going to stand there and argue with them all day. So, before they could pile on more complaints or guilt trips, I turned and headed for the door. As I left the house, I could still hear them talking, probably trying to figure out how to get around this, how to keep living there for free, but I wasn't going to budge. I'd given them their choices: pay rent or move out, and in 3 months they were going to have to face reality. They just didn't know yet that the house wasn't even my dad's to give them. Update 2. It happened faster than I anticipated. One day, my dad was still holding on, and the next, he was gone. Even though I had known it was coming, the impact still hit me like a ton of bricks. Watching him slip away like that wasn't easy, but at least I could take solace in knowing he was finally at peace. The pain he'd carried for so long was over, and that was the only comfort I could find in the aftermath. But after the funeral came the real test. No surprise, Karen and her kids, Brittany and David, were acting as if nothing had changed. It was almost as if they had been waiting for this moment, expecting everything to fall neatly into their hands now that my dad was gone. They thought they were ready to take over, to assume control, but they had no idea what was coming for them. I gave it a few days to let the dust settle after the funeral, but I wasn't going to let it drag on. The sooner I dealt with this, the better. They were probably under the illusion they could stay in that house forever, free of charge, but I had other plans in mind. So, I went over to the house. When I arrived, Karen was sitting in the living room with Brittany and David, lounging like they owned the place. They were laughing about something on the TV, completely oblivious to the fact that my dad had just passed. No grief. No sadness. Just them, going about their lives like it was any other day. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them. It felt surreal. How could they be so unaffected? My dad had just died, and here they were, acting like nothing had changed. Finally, I cleared my throat and stepped inside. Karen turned to look at me, but didn't say a word. Neither did Brittany or David. They just sat there, waiting, probably assuming I was there to discuss funeral arrangements. I took a steadying breath. "We need to talk about the house," I said, my voice calm but firm. Karen frowned, clearly not grasping what I meant. "What do you mean? We've already discussed this. We're staying here, just like James wanted." And there it was, the entitlement I'd been expecting. I felt my anger surge, but I kept my composure. I wasn't going to let them provoke me. "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "We haven't discussed this. You think you're staying here, but the truth is, you're not. This house isn't James's to give. It's mine. I bought it for him after my mom died, and now that he's gone, it goes back to me." The room went dead silent. I could see the shock on Karen's face, as if she had no idea what I was talking about. She blinked a few times, trying to process my words, before finally stammering, "What are you talking about? James never told me that. This is our home." I almost laughed. "Yeah, well, he didn't need to tell you. This house was never his to give. I bought it for him to live in after he lost his apartment, but it's been in my name the entire time, and now that he's gone, it's time for you to leave too." "But," Brittany stood up, looking furious. "You can't just kick us out. We've been living here for years. This is our home now." I turned to her, keeping my voice steady. "No, it's not your home. You've been living here for free, and I've let it slide because of my dad. But now that he's gone, that stops. You either start paying rent, or you leave. You have 3 months to figure it out." They were all stunned. Karen looked like she was about to cry, but she quickly turned that into anger. "You can't do this to us! James wanted us to stay here!" "I'm sorry," I said, although I didn't really mean it. "But that's not how this works legally. This is my house, and I'm not going to let you stay here without paying rent. You've been taking advantage of my dad for years, and I'm done letting it happen." Karen tried to argue, but I wasn't listening anymore. I could feel the tension building in the room, but I wasn't backing down. This was my house, and I had every right to do what I was doing. "I've already spoken to my lawyer," I added, pulling out the paperwork to prove it. "If you don't believe me, here it is in black and white. I own this house, not you and not my dad. I've given you 3 months to figure out what you're going to do. After that, if you're not out, I'll have no problem evicting you." David was sitting on the couch, staring at the paperwork with her mouth hanging open. "This can't be happening," she muttered, looking at Karen for some kind of reassurance. But Karen had nothing. She knew it was over. I could see it in her eyes. She had been banking on this house, thinking they could just stay here forever rent-free. But now reality was hitting them hard. "You've got to be kidding me," Brittany said, pacing around the room. "After everything we've done for James, you're just throwing us out?" I almost laughed again. "Everything you've done? You mean disrespecting him, pushing him to get rid of Max, and treating him like a guest in his own home? Yeah, real generous of you." They all started talking at once, trying to defend themselves, but I wasn't listening anymore. I'd had enough of their excuses, their entitlement, their complete lack of respect. My dad deserved better, and I wasn't going to let them keep living in this house like they owned it. "I've said what I came to say," I told them, turning toward the door. "You've got 3 months. After that, we'll see what happens." As I left, I could hear them still arguing behind me, trying to figure out what they were going to do, but that wasn't my problem anymore. They had spent years living off my dad, off of me, and now it was time for them to deal with the consequences. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I walked out of the house. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I was doing the right thing. I had let them take advantage of the situation for too long, and now it was time to take back what was mine. This house wasn't theirs, it never was, and soon enough they were going to be out of my life for good. Update 3. So after I told Karen and her daughters they had to move out or start paying rent, I figured that was the end of it. I mean, what else could they do? I had the law on my side, all the paperwork showing I owned the house, and I gave them more than enough time to figure things out. 3 months was fair, right? Well, apparently Karen didn't think so, because get this, she tried to sue me. Yeah, Karen actually went to a lawyer and filed a lawsuit claiming she had a right to stay in the house because she was my dad's wife and had been promised it after he died. When I first heard about it, I almost laughed. I got served the paperwork one afternoon while I was at work, and my first reaction was, "You've got to be kidding me." I mean, what was she thinking? She knew I owned the house. I'd shown her the documents, spoken to her calmly about it, and even gave her more time than most people would to get her life sorted out. But no, apparently that wasn't enough. She decided to take it to court, thinking she'd somehow win. Now, I've never been a fan of going to court. The whole process is just a headache, but at the same time, I wasn't worried. I had my lawyer lined up and ready to go, and I knew we had everything we needed to shut this thing down before it even got off the ground. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. He was calm about it, probably because this kind of nonsense happens more often than you'd think. He went over the paperwork Karen filed and said, "Yeah, this isn't going to go anywhere. They don't have a leg to stand on." Nay, even so, I couldn't shake the annoyance bubbling inside me. I had already let them live in my house rent-free for years. What more did they want? The whole thing dragged on for months. Karen kept making these ridiculous claims about how my dad promised her the house, even though there was zero proof or paperwork to back it up. She tried playing the grieving widow, acting like I was some kind of monster for kicking her out of her home, but the truth was, she had no legal right to the house at all. During the hearings, I had to sit through her lawyer trying to spin a story about how Karen and my dad had plans to leave the house to her after he passed. She played up how she'd put so much into making it a home for them. Yeah, sure. What she conveniently left out was how she and her daughters had taken over the place, treated my dad like an unwelcome guest in his own home, and even tried to get rid of Max, my dad's dog. But of course, none of that came up. I kept my cool through most of it. I knew the judge wasn't buying her sob story, and my lawyer was doing an excellent job shutting down every claim Karen's side threw at us. We had all the documents proving the house was mine, title deeds, bank records, everything. Every time they tried to bring up some promise my dad supposedly made, we hit them with cold, hard facts. One of the more absurd moments came when Karen tried to claim she deserved compensation for improvements she made to the house. Improvements? The house was in the exact same condition it had been in when I bought it. If anything, it was in worse shape because they hadn't bothered to take care of it. My lawyer pointed that out, and the judge shut that argument down with a simple wave of his hand. To make matters worse, Karen's daughters, Brittany and David, had the nerve to show up in court, acting like they were victims in all of this. Brittany started talking about how they'd been living there for years and how it was their home, and I just sat there thinking, you've been living here for free, and now you're acting like I owe you something? I wanted to speak up, but my lawyer gave me that look, the one that said, let it go. So, I stayed quiet. It didn't take long for the judge to make a decision. He basically said what we all knew from the start. Karen had no claim to the house. There was no will, no written agreement, and nothing that showed my dad had ever promised her anything. Since the house was legally mine, Karen and her daughters were going to have to move out. I wish I could say I was surprised, but honestly, I wasn't. I knew this was how it would end. The whole lawsuit was just a desperate attempt to hold on to something they never had a right to in the first place. The judge gave them a final deadline, 2 weeks to move out, or the eviction process would begin. When we walked out of the courtroom, Karen wouldn't even look at me. She just stormed off, with Brittany and David trailing behind her, acting like I was the one who'd done something terrible. But I didn't feel bad. I'd given them more time and more chances than they deserved, and they still tried to screw me over. In the end, they didn't have much of a choice after the court ruling. They packed up and left. I didn't hear from them again after that. No phone calls, no texts, nothing. It was like they'd disappeared, and honestly, I was relieved. The whole thing had been a nightmare, but now it was over. The house was finally mine again, and I didn't have to deal with their drama anymore. Sure, it had been a long, exhausting process, but I came out on top. Karen? She lost. It didn't matter what promises she thought my dad made. In the end, the law was the law, and she couldn't change that. So yeah, she tried to sue me, and she lost. Now the house is mine, and they're gone for good, and honestly, that's all I ever wanted. What do you do when someone who's taken advantage of you for years finally tries to claim what's yours? Do you let them walk all over you, or do you stand your ground and take back what belongs to you? For years, Karen and her daughters lived in the house that was never theirs, using my dad's death as an excuse to stake a claim on it. They thought the house was theirs for the taking, but they had no idea what was coming. They wanted to make my dad's passing into an opportunity to get everything they could until the law stepped in and shattered their delusions. I gave them time, I gave them options, and when it came down to it, I wasn't going to let them take what was rightfully mine. The legal documents were clear. The facts were undeniable, and in the end, they couldn't manipulate their way out of it. Their attempts to hold on to the house were no match for the truth. The court ruled in my favor, and just like that, they were out. But here's the question. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have stood up for yourself like I did, or would you have let them continue to use you? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you found this story empowering, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more.